Hey everyone, this is update for June 15, 2022, day 112 of the war, end of the date update. We're gonna focus today much more on strategic issues, as there's not that many of sort of changes on the front line since yesterday. There is intense fighting going on in our typical locations, but there is no meaningful changes in the front line. We'll still discuss that, but let's actually touch many important strategic topics. So first of all, we got some statistics from a private Ukrainian volunteer hospital that operates in Severodonetsk area. Specifically, it's in Bakhmut, and now they moved to Slavyansk because of the threat of the rocket strikes and artillery strikes. So their statistics that 99% of the wounded are due to artillery and mortar fire, and only 1% due to the small arms. This is another data point that shows that this war is really a war of artillery. And in this way, this war is very similar to World War One and World War Two. It's totally different from the conflicts that happened after it. Maybe Korean War is another one that's probably relevant for this situation. And because this is totally different conflict, a lot of the training that's being done with Ukrainian conscript, which is based on sort of support that Ukraine gets from NATO, is in many ways irrelevant, right? Because that training is more focused on, using small arms, preparing for low intensity conflict, which is completely different, 180 degrees, not what is going on in Ukraine. And the best approach is actually to use experiences from World War One and World War Two. And specifically how to survive artillery fire. So that's one sort of interesting data point. Another one is about Russian oil export, or let's say energy situation. So now there's new statistics that shows that Russia receives about $87 per barrel for the oil that it exports. We discussed this question sometime in May, and at that time Russia was receiving about $73 per barrel. So you can see that all of these sanctions are completely misguided. They actually backfire and create a lot of problems, actually put the burden of all of this back on the West. So this is completely misguided policy that actually leads to very negative consequences, and we will discuss them, how politically it actually now backfires against Ukraine. And to kind of repeat, to explain how it works, Russia exports this crude oil at discount, because right now, let's say it's 120, to countries like India, specifically India, where the export grew exponentially to India over past two months. And so now the India is processing that crude oil and then exports refined products, diesel and gasoline, to Europe and US, and essentially killing refining industry there and all of the chemical complexes there, right? So it's essentially, you cannot compete when India gets their crude much cheaper. The cost of labor there is cheaper, so everything else is cheaper. So you cannot really compete. So this is again undermines any this sanctions are totally in this way counterproductive. So that's one. Then there is another one, is a situation with natural gas. So we don't know actually reasons why, but Russia is reducing amount of natural gas that flows through Nord Stream 1. So this is not Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is not working. We're talking about Nord Stream 1. This is the one that's been working for a while, and it's supplying natural gas to Germany. So Russia reduced the flow of natural gas by a third, And we believe there is another announcement that it's going to reduce by another third. So it could be up to 2/3 of natural gas basically are shut off by Russia. So to Europe, right? So that really probably again going to create tremendous pressure in Europe on European economies and so on. And just to explain, essentially all of the German industry is and to lesser extent Italy and even lesser extent France, they all heavily depend on energy supplies from Russia. Otherwise, essentially, German economy is not going to be competitive and self-destruct, self-implode on the international sort of scale, right? So essentially, the situation is very difficult in those countries economy-wise, and we're not talking about small businesses. We're talking really about big businesses like large chemical companies that there are a bunch of them in Germany. There's BASF, Bayer, and so on, Siemens, but they're supplying actually they're exporting a lot to Russia. So essentially, this creates huge pain at the mass level in Germany, in German economy, right? So, and we'll go back to what really this creates. So as a result of that, there is very clear change in attitude in the West towards support of Ukraine and continuation of this war. So there was a meeting today, even though I say morning, but it was today on June 15 of their sort of donors and supporters, military supporters of Ukraine. So as a result of that meeting, Ukraine only got 1,855 M777 howitzers. Prior meeting, Ukraine received, I think, 90 or 108. So you see that there is basically nobody's saying, hey, we're not supporting. Everybody's sort of, saying, hey, we support, everything's great. But the sort of actions speak louder than words. It's very clear that there is a kind of signal being sent to sort of Ukrainian leadership, hey, go and find truce or peace or capitulate with Russia. There's too much pain, too much economic pain to us. We cannot really withstand it. And if this keeps going, we're really concerned, right? So this is what's been going on. And actually, the next step in this, on the 16th, 3 leaders from Germany, Chancellor of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz coming, then President of France coming, Emmanuel Macron, and then Prime Minister of Italy, Draghi, I don't know his first name, is coming to Ukraine. They're all 3 coming to Ukraine on the 16th, which is actually right now. And the only reason they are coming to Ukraine is to convince or probably threaten Ukrainian leadership and say, hey, you really need to capitulate, accept the Russian conditions, whatever they are, and let's sort of, let's close it up. Let's just stop this war. Let's have this, maybe it's not a peace, but a truce, but there is no war. And, expectation is that things are going to go back to normal, which it's very extremely misguided. They will not go back to normal, but this is kind of, desperation move because there is no plan B. There is no better approaches to solve the problem in these 3 countries, right? This is especially painful in these 3 countries. So that's why the leaders of those countries are coming to Ukraine to essentially push Ukrainian president to accept some form of capitulation. And there is, in this way, there is a clear split in sort of West between, let's say, UK, US, like Canada and Poland, and then it's one group of countries, and then there is these 3 countries, Germany, France, and Italy, who are sort of more pushing towards peace at any cost with Russia. So it's probably we can speculate whether this is going to work out for them or not. We are very skeptical because at this point the attitude inside of Ukrainian society is kind of like very against this capitulation, because people already invested with their lives very, very heavily, let's put this way. Nevertheless, this is going to be an attempt, and we'll see what happens. And the reason why it's a very misguided attempt that actually will backfire and will lead to actually bigger problems, we're going to look at the case in history that happened, and there is a lot of similarities with what's going on right now with Ukraine in many ways. So we're going to go actually back to Commonwealths of Poland and Lithuania that existed in 18th century, and let's actually look at what happened there. So this was original. Actually, look this one. So this one was original Commonwealths of Lithuania and Poland. The governments there was completely dysfunctional. They were not up to sort of. They were not sort of modern. They were not modernizing. Basically, it was basically a mess in terms of governance, and as a result, they had this country. It's even hard to say it's really country, but basically, this area had three strong competitors, right? That were really reforming very quickly. It was Russian Empire. This is Russian Empire here, then Austrian Empire here, and then Prussia, which is essentially, the kind of creator of Germany in many ways, right? It's not the only one, but it was the sort of one of the drivers. So let's call it Germany in a way, because it was sort of proto-Germany at that time. So what they did is they actually, it's called partitions of the Commonwealths of Poland and Lithuania. So they did first partition in 1772. So as you can see, this is what Russia took from the country. This is what Germany took, and this is what Austrian Empire took. So so it didn't bring the government in the remaining part to their senses in terms of changing, modernizing country, making it better, stronger economy-wise, and so on. They just kept going with their policies of that time. So that led to their this so-called three neighbors seeing that the country is still weak and so on. They did another partition in 1793, right? So this is what Russia took in that one, and this is what Germany took in that one, right? So this is what's left over, right? So, and it still didn't help the government, no changes, and as a result, in 1795, it ceased to exist. So this went to Russia, this went to Germany, this one went to Austrian Empire. So as you can see, that over a period from 1772 to 1795, a large country actually ceased to exist. It was larger than Prussia, right? Than this sort of proto-Germany. It used to be very strong, competitor for Russia. Let's say, for example, not many people know that they controlled Smolensk. Which is almost next door to Moscow, but essentially the country ceased to exist. And what we're trying to say is that this is the same strategy that Russia is pursuing right now in Ukraine. It started this war in 2014, and it doesn't have enough sort of ability to chew all of the Ukraine at once. So it just bites small piece, and it was first Crimea and piece of, let's go back, and first it was Crimea, and then this piece of Donetsk and Luhansk region. So they bit off that, chew that more or less, and then this is another. So this is, let's say, it was the first partition, right? So this is now attempt at the second partition, and obviously desire to take much more, or sort of completely consume the country, right? So what we're trying to say is that this sort of truce or whatever capitulation is not going to stop Russia by any means. The goal of Russia is to take over the entire of Ukraine, and that allows them to rebuild essentially Soviet Union. So once that is done in, let's say, 5 years, the whole, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, probably Kazakhstan, then Europe will be facing that, basically, and specifically Poland, because the Poland and Baltic states are, and to extent Finland, are sort of next, goals, next objectives. Because if you look what's being done by the Russian president, he wants to rebuild actually Russian empire, not the Soviet Union. Basically, in a Russian political leadership, there is sort of two sides. One is wants to kind of recreate Soviet Union. The other one wants to recreate Russian empire. And in this way, Putin represents the side that wants to recreate Russian empire. What this really means, not only territory-wise, but it actually in terms of economic approach, right? So Russian empire was based on capitalism. It wasn't perfect. It was in a way, many ways terrible, but nevertheless, it was still capitalism. You cannot call it some kind of like collectivism or communism. Versus the part that's for sort of pro-Soviet Union, they want to rebuild Soviet Union, right? So right now, the Russian political landscape is dominated by this sort of pro-Russian empire sort of group. And as such, the territory, if just there's a sort of reminder for the viewers, the territory of Russian Empire included also Finland, Baltic states, and Poland. So this may not happen, in a year or two, but this is long-term goal, right? This is where, sort of Russia is shooting for over long run. And then there is another sort of analogy from all of this, is that in a way, like Poland and Ukraine, they're kind of like insulator between the Russia and the Germany. And once these insulators are removed, there is almost always, or not always, but there is almost inevitable clash between the Russia and the Germany. And this was exactly what happened in 1939, when there was Poland between the Soviet Union and the Third Reich. And once that insulator was removed, which that led eventually to the clash between the countries, right? So this, while it may be solving sort of immediate political needs of these three leaders in Europe, it really sets up for much, much bigger and much more painful disaster down the road. And that's really sort of concerning, and that's really the biggest problem so far. So now let's move a little bit to different topic in terms of this HIMARS multiple rocket launching system that Ukraine is getting. So just kind of give you statistics. So essentially, Ukraine will get 12 M142 from the US. Then Ukraine is going to get 4 M270 from the UK, and then 4 from Germany, which M270, which I would say it's a big question that Ukraine will get that. So in total, Ukraine may have from 16 to 20 of this multiple rocket launchers. And again, this is presented as some kind of like a Wunderwaffe in sort of German World War II terms, or wonder weapon, which it is not. They're very too few in quantity to create a meaningful difference on the front line. Well, they definitely help, and it's a good help, but it's totally, it's really a drop in the bucket essentially for what Ukraine really needs to change the situation, to at least stop further advance of the Russian troops. right? So, and then actually another data point on the situation on the Russian side that I forgot to mention is so there's a lot of advertising right now to to basically recruiting advertising to join Wagner Group, right? This is Wagner mercenaries. This is represented the company, sort of the umbrella is Wagner Group. So there's a lot of them, and then there's apparently not enough sort of let's say mercenaries, or people who want to sort of fight for money. And so what they did, they actually relaxed the terms. So before, one of the sort of key term that you don't have any basically you didn't go to jail, I don't know, like whatever, you were not convicted in some kind in crimes, essentially. I think that's probably a better way to say it. And this was actually relaxed to the point that if you were convicted in sort of what soft crimes, and this term is sort of is unclear what it really truly means, but if you have soft crimes, you can still join. So sort of our read is soft crime. This probably means like as long as you didn't kill anyone, then it's all okay. So as you can see, there's clear sort of there's not enough basically human resources, soldiers, right, on the ground, and the terms are getting relaxed progressively in sort of this Wagner group, in regular Russian army, and essentially everywhere. And there is another sort of supporting data point for this. So the Russian military administration started forming military units from collaborators in the captured territory. So they formed first unit in Zaporizhia region, and there was joined. There are 200 people who joined that unit. It's still sort of it's just very first step, right? And the logic for this is, okay, we're gonna use them to do the sort of secondary, like sort of like low quality duty, right? So like guarding and like of the rear and stuff like that. They're not gonna go to the front line, but that allows us to free up our own soldiers, so like from regular army, to go to the front line. So this is that's the idea behind this whole process, essentially. So now we're done with all of the sort of strategic and general questions. Now let's jump into the to review of the front line. As we're going to start from the very north, and we're going to go down south in a clockwise fashion. So along this northern border, as always, there is an exchange of artillery fire. No changes here. So the same shelling on both sides, as we call it, artillery ping pong. Then let's go down south to Kharkiv. Let's see what's going on there. Situation is sort of same. There is renewed Russian pressure to kind of push Ukrainian troops even more south of Ternova in this area of Starytsya, basically to capture this forest and essentially to push all the way Ukrainian troops all the way to Starysaltiv. So far, there is no progress. It's still small-scale fighting of the company-size troops. It's still nothing really major, but there is clearly more focus, more effort by the Russian side to push Ukrainian troops further from the state border. Now let's keep going. Let's look what's going on now. Let's move to Izyum bridgehead. So this is very high-level schematic overview of the units that are fighting on the Izyum bridgehead. And now let's actually look what's going on there. So there was heavy pressure here at Dolyna and Krasnopillya. This is one area of heavy fighting. So essentially the fighting is going on outskirts of the two villages. Let's just quickly jump in here. So this is Dolyna and Krasnopillya. This is basically essentially one village. And so the fighting is kind of keeps going here. There was no meaningful progress by the Russian side. And the fighting is still going on in Bogorodychne. The exact front line is not clear. The Russian sources claim that they pushed Ukrainian troops on the outskirts of Bogorodychne. totally possible. Basically, the fighting is going on somewhere, either in Bogorodychne or on outskirts of Bogorodychne. So essentially, no sort of large, meaningful change here in the front line. Situation here on this peninsula is stable. It's being controlled by Ukrainian army so far, and there's no new attacks, no new attempts by Russian troops to create bridgeheads in this area. Now let's move to Severodonetsk area. Let's look at what's going on at Severodonetsk salient. So essentially, situation of Ukrainian troops is very difficult, as we discussed. With the loss of both bridges, the logistics, the resupplying is extremely difficult. It got to the point that their soldiers, individual soldiers, cross the river just swimming across. The lucky sort of part of it is that the water level is extremely low because it's kind of like dry, unusually dry. So it's essentially very fordable. So it's kind of like lucky coincidence right now. But you can imagine how difficult it is if you as an individual soldier, to the point that you just need to swim across the river. And lucky that's not big river. The Ukrainian troops are essentially, as we discussed before, they are defending this chemical complex. And that actually is producing nitrogen fertilizers that we discussed yesterday. So there is a large pipeline with natural gas that was coming from Russia, and then it was processed, that natural gas, and they were producing a lot of nitrogen fertilizer here. But essentially at this point the fighting is still going on here. No essential changes in terms of Ukrainian troops are sort of losing it, or they're defending, they're standing the ground. They're obviously not in position to attack or recapture Severodonetsk. It's a totally defensive fighting here from Ukrainian side. Now let's look what's going on here on this northern shoulder of this Popasna salient. There was a lot of Russian pressure and attacks everywhere here in Bogorodychne, Berestove, Mykolaiivka, Vrubivka. All of this area, it's basically like ring of fire here. So Russian troops made a really strong attack towards Vrubivka. Let's actually look here. So they basically got to outskirts of Vrubivka essentially. We don't have sort of exact location of the front line, and then Ukrainian sources say that Russian troops were pushed back to the original sort of attack launching position. So we don't have good confirmation for the situation here. So we just want to say Vrubivka is still in Ukrainian hands, but there is very intense fighting here. And if Ukrainian forces lose it, it will be extremely negative development for this whole area around Zolote and Hirske, which will be, there might be very high probability of forced evacuation of this area, because otherwise it's going to be very nearly impossible to resupply troops in this area. Otherwise, this area more or less stable. And let's actually look a little bit more in the sort of the southern section of this Popasna salient, specifically what Wagner mercenaries are doing here, and this First Army Corps, which we're trying to kind of create encirclement of Ukrainian troops in this small area. So essentially, Wagner mercenaries are trying to cross this road and attack towards Semihiria. This is the village, and then the First Army Corps will just basically attack towards north. And so essentially then you're creating, you're encircling Ukrainian troops in this area, or forcing withdrawal of those troops. So far they were not successful, but it's definitely not not simple situation here. So this is the sort of direction of the Russian attacks by the Wagner mercenaries. So they're just essentially trying to kind of like attack towards kind of like southwest, and then basically go towards Semigiri, and the First Army Corps is essentially almost there, so they're pretty close. So, but there were no progress today by this attacking troops. Now let's look what's going on west of Donetsk. The situation here is stable, no really major changes. Then there is this shelling of Donetsk, and there are some viewers in the comments asking like, okay, who is this doing, Ukraine or Russia? And to be very objective, you really need to do investigation to be literally go there, and it's possible to determine who did it, factually. But obviously, you will never be able to get there to do independent investigation and research, right? So it's impossible, and that's why it's being done, because let's say Russian side knows that it's impossible to sort of determine who did it, because they will not allow independent investigators there. But as a reference point to why we say there is no reason for Ukrainian army to do that, because it obviously paints extremely negative picture of Ukrainian army, right? If you shell civilians, right, randomly shelling civilian just randomly shelling at the city, this is just you basically shooting yourself in the head by doing that, right? So there's no point, there's no incentive basically for Ukrainian army to do it, right? So that's why we sort of side with sort of assumption. This is not, we're not saying, hey, this is for sure true, because as we said, unless you do investigation, by actually looking at the facts on the ground, you will never be able to be 100% certain in one way or another. But there's no total incentive for Ukrainian side to do anything like that, because then it's obviously, spread by Russian propaganda that Ukrainian army is attacking civilians and, doing all of that stuff. It's just, it's totally, it's plain stupid, let's put this way, for Ukrainian army to do that. And then what we would like to sort of bring is actually a historical example where actually Soviet army was doing kind of stuff like that in 1939 in order to sort of gain a casus belli for the war with Finland. What the Soviet artillery did, they shelled some border town on the Soviet side, which is called Mainila, which is actually totally Finnish name, but nevertheless it was controlled by Soviet Union at that time, and probably still is. But essentially, so the Soviet Union said, oh, okay, Finnish army is shelling our territory, shelling our, I think it was town. So they, trying to kill our civilians. Therefore, we're gonna attack Finland and punish them and do all of that stuff. So basically, it's very similar to what Germany did to Poland with Gleiwitz incident, right? So it's it's this kind of approach is being played many times in history, and there is also more recent example where Russian leadership actually, Russian FSB essentially blew up several residential buildings in Russia with civilians. That was done in September of 1999, and the reason and the way it was, the purpose for that was actually to have a casus belli to start the second Chechen war, which was started then immediately after that, because the blame went to Chechen sort of nation, that they are sort of terrorists. They blowing up all of the civilians, all of the civilian buildings, and there were about 300 civilians killed in the process. So what this really kind of tells is that governments that based on sort of dictatorship, for them their own people are essentially expendable tools to get to their sort of higher sort of objective or whatever higher goal that they determine for themselves, right? So there is people just disposable objects, right? So that's kind of like some kind of evidence what makes us believe that it's not Ukrainian army. There's no reason for Ukrainian army to shell Donetsk, basically. So this is just our thoughts. We're not saying, hey, we know this 100% that this is certain that this is what's going on, because as we said, you really need to investigate and get on the ground there, and then you actually can determine for sure who is shelling, where it's coming from, and so on. So it's possible to have factual investigation. So hopefully that answers those questions from some of the viewers. So now let's. This is just a closer view of this Avdiivka area. This is where there's this immediate Russian objective. Now let's keep going and let's look at Zaporizhia front line. Situation there is essentially frozen. It's positional defenses by both sides. No really changes. This is the whole stretch of the front line. As we discussed, it's centered around strongholds because there is no continuous front line, because both sides don't have enough manpower to create continuous front line. And the situation at Kherson bridgehead is essentially the same to the Zaporizhia front line. Everything is on hold. Both sides are digging in, exchange of artillery fire, reconnaissance action, skirmishes, but really no major action on both sides. That's it for today, and thanks for watching, and until tomorrow, bye bye.